This Bible story from the book of Judges 19 will leave you shocked and speechless. There is a story in the Old Testament that, if I'm being honest with you, I find to be the most disturbing in the entire Bible. It could be considered inappropriate for minors. So before you watch this video, I want to make sure you know that it is not suitable for all ages and may trigger some sort of trauma from your past. The story I'm referring to is in chapters 19 through 21 of the book of Judges. Many people are familiar with chapter 19, but they don't read the rest of the story. I believe there are several important lessons that you and I need to learn from such a disturbing story. First, I'm going to tell the story in the most dramatic way possible, and then we'll explore the lessons that I believe we can learn. Let's go together to Judges chapter 19. In the first part of the story, we are introduced to a Levite, a member of the tribe of Levi, who decides to acquire a woman to be his concubine. This choice raises questions about the practices and customs of the time, where having a concubine was acceptable in some circumstances. The Levite lives in a remote region in the hills of Ephraim in northern Israel, while the woman is from Bethlehem in the south. The geographical discrepancy between their origins highlights the cultural and social differences that may have influenced their relationship. The Levite's decision to acquire this woman as a concubine may seem ordinary in that historical context, but the consequences of this choice will have a profound and disturbing impact on the subsequent narrative. In the second part of the story, after the woman betrays the Levite and returns to her home in Bethlehem, the Levite decides to undertake a journey to rescue her. Driven by a mixture of love, duty, and wounded pride, he sets out south, leaving the mountains of Ephraim behind. The journey is marked by moments of reflection and anguish as he travels the dusty roads towards Bethlehem. Along the way, he faces unexpected challenges, such as sudden storms and encounters with strangers who test his resolve. The distance between the north and the south symbolizes not only the geographic separation between the Levite and his concubine, but also the emotional and spiritual divisions that must be overcome. Upon arriving in Bethlehem, he finds a city different from the one he remembered. The streets are emptier. The faces seem more somber. The search for the lost woman becomes an inner journey, where he confronts his own flaws and weaknesses. The narrative slowly unfolds as he approaches the conclusion of this tragic story. In the third part of the story, after spending the night at the man's house in Geba, the Levite and his concubine continue their journey north toward Ephraim. The sun slowly sets on the horizon, turning the sky golden and pink as they make their way along the dusty roads. The atmosphere is filled with tension and fear, for they know they are in unfamiliar and dangerous territory. As they approach Jebus, a strange and gloomy city comes into view. The servant suggests that they stop there for the night, but the master refuses, fearing the hostile inhabitants of that region. They decide to continue on to Geba or Ramah in search of a more welcoming place to rest. When they finally reach Gibeah, in the tribe of Benjamin, they are greeted with distrust and rejection by the local community. No one is willing to welcome them into their homes, leaving them vulnerable and helpless in the face of the dark night that is fast approaching. It is in this moment of despair and loneliness that an old man appears in the city square and offers shelter to the Levite, his servant, and his concubine in his humble home in Gibeah. In the fourth part of the story, the Levite, his servant, and his concubine are welcomed into the home of the old man in Gibeah. The home is simple, with weathered stone walls and rustic furnishings that tell stories of generations past. The ambience is welcoming, with the warmth of a crackling fireplace filling the main room. The host, a weary but kind-hearted man, invites them to sit around the table while he prepares a modest but comforting meal. The aroma of fresh bread and aromatic herbs fills the room, creating an atmosphere of peace amidst the turmoil of the world outside. As they share the simple bread and wine, the Levite feels a mixture of gratitude and melancholy as he thinks of the journey that still lies ahead. The host's generous hospitality is a silent reminder of the humanity that still exists even in life's darkest moments. In the fifth part of the story, the atmosphere around the host's house in Geber becomes increasingly sinister and threatening. The wicked men who surround the residence begin to bang on the doors violently, demanding that the Levite be handed over to them to satisfy their carnal desires. The sound of the blows echoes through the deserted street, echoing like a grim warning of impending danger. The host, apprehensive and fearful, tries to calm the heated spirits outside, begging them to give up their insane demand. But the men, overcome by lust and cruelty, refuse to listen to any appeal to reason or compassion. The tension reaches its peak when they threaten to break down the doors and invade the sacred space of the house, disregarding not only the hospitality offered, but also the most basic principles of respect and human dignity. In the sixth part of the story, the situation reaches a point of complete desolation and despair. The host, in an act of desperation and inhumanity, proposes a shocking solution to protect the Levite to offer his own virgin daughter and concubine to be abused in place of the guest. Shock and sadness mix on the Levite's face as he realizes the terrible choice that is presented to him. The innocent daughter is dragged out of the house, her face reflecting horror and resignation at the cruel fate that awaits her. Meanwhile, the concubine remains huddled in a dark corner of the room, her empty eyes reflecting the pain and suffering she has already endured. The heavy atmosphere of betrayal and sacrifice hangs over everyone present, while the Levite is faced with the unbearable weight of the decision he will have to make to save his own life. In the seventh part of the story, the violence reaches its climax when the perverted men drag the concubine out of her host's house in Gibeah. The darkness of night envelops the macabre scene, while the woman's anguished screams echo through the deserted streets. She struggles desperately against her attackers, but is overwhelmed by the brute force and cruelty of her tormentors. Each moment of agony and terror is an affront to human dignity, an act of barbarity that forever stains the memory of that fateful night. As the Levite watches helplessly, his concubine is subjected to unimaginable torment, her voice muffled by screams of pain and despair. The horror of sexual violence unfolds before the shocked eyes of all present, leaving an indelible scar on the soul and conscience of those who witness such brutality. The next morning, at dawn, the Levite woke up with a heavy heart. When he opened his eyes, he found himself faced with a tragic scene. His concubine lay inert on the floor, pale and bloody. The morning silence was interrupted only by the lament of the wind blowing through the cracks in the house. With trembling hands he approached her, kneeling beside her. His teary eyes stared at her once beautiful face, now marked by violence and suffering. In a gesture of despair and farewell, he gently stroked her tangled hair and murmured words of farewell that echoed hollowly in that dark environment. Lifting her carefully, he wrapped her lifeless body in a simple cloak, as if he wanted to protect her even beyond death. With slow and sorrowful steps, he carried her out of the house, facing the accusing gaze of the sun that was rising on the horizon. The city woke up to another day as he left, carrying in his arms the burden of an irreparable loss. In the ninth part of the story, the Levite, consumed by grief and anger at the brutality inflicted on his concubine, makes a macabre and disturbing decision. With trembling hands and eyes brimming with tears, he takes a sharp knife and, in an act of desperation and vengeance, cuts the woman's body into 12 pieces. Each cut is like a wound in the Levite's soul, reflecting the pain and sadness that consume him. The silence of the house is broken by the sharp sound of metal against flesh, creating an eerie symphony of horror and despair. After completing this terrible task, he wraps each piece in simple cloth and prepares them to be sent to the 12 tribes of Israel. Each package contains not only the remains of the concubine, but also the silent message of an unspeakable tragedy that is ravaging the land. The Levite then sets out on a dark journey to deliver the horrific packages to the leaders of the tribes, carrying with him the unbearable weight of their irreparable loss. In the 10th part of the story, the tragedy unleashed by the death of the Levite's concubine spreads like wildfire through the tribes of Israel. The heinous act committed against the defenseless woman echoes like a cry of grief and indignation throughout the land. News of the terrible events that took place in Gibeah spreads quickly, sparking a wave of revolt and mourning among the Israelites. Tribal leaders call emergency councils to deliberate on how to deal with such an atrocity and restore peace between the divided tribes. The discussions are heated, emotions running high, as each leader expresses his outrage and determination to bring justice for the innocent soul lost. The search for answers and solutions leads to intense debates and decisive actions that will shape the destiny of the tribes of Israel forever. If you want to delve deeper into this shocking story and discover the lessons we can learn from it, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Always remember, every decision has its consequences. May we learn from the biblical stories and apply these lessons in our daily lives. Until the next video.